Good morning, Dan and Amy. Brown girl, what do you feel? Reads the teacher. That black girl magic will help us all heal, recite the children. Stanley Eugene Clark Public School in Brooklyn, New York, where a poetic rendition is dedicated to Senator Kamala Harris, who even elementary school children know, waiting in the wings to become the Vice President of the United States.
First female Vice President.
Thanks for the update.
You're welcome.
The poem is an update of Leslie Honore's poem Brown Girl, which she originally wrote in 2016 for her book of poetry. I'm sure you have it. It's so interesting, the Dear Leader serenades that are advanced by teachers in taxpayer-funded public school settings. Do you remember this one? From elementary students at Burlington, New Jersey, at a Burlington, New Jersey public school for Dear Leader Obama.
Now's the moment when he's what's to sing. Sing with all your heart. For our children, for our families, nations all join as one. Sing for joy and sing abundant peace. Courage, justice, hope. Sing together, hold each precious hand, lifting each other up. Sing for vision, sing for unity, lifting our hearts to sing.
Oh, yeah.
While wearing Obama Hope T-shirts.
I'm sure there's.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure they did one for Trump. Yeah, Orange Man bad. I can just hear how that one went.
The point should be that if any politician saw a teacher instructing children in that way, they should be offended and put an immediate end to it. That is Chinese communist quality propagandizing. Public schools. Happened with Obama. It happened with Hillary Clinton, even though she was never elected. And it's happening now with Biden and Kamala Harris. So how do we get to this place, you're asking yourselves?
What happened?
Right. It just started under Trump. Hardly.
You've been warning us for decades.
Hardly. And the implications from pre-K through post-secondary education as the walls close in on our individual rights. And I don't think that's overstating the case at all. Just ask Abigail Schreier. She's the author of a book on identitarian politics, specifically trans movement. Irreversible Damage is the name of her book, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. The deputy director of trans studies at the ACLU has suggested that her book not be distributed. The ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, and of course, all of your fungible academics, universities across the country saying the same thing. ACLU is not going to defend unpopular opinions, even though that's basically their charter. Nope. For more on this, we're pleased to be joined by Eric Kaufman, professor of politics at Birkbeck College, University of London, and author of White Shift, Populism, Immigration, and the Future of White Majorities. Eric, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Good to be here, Dan.
You've done an interesting study. You wrote about academic freedom and cancel culture, and I think it's a little bit more serious than cancel culture. I mean, I think this is a purge. And by the way, it's not just Twitter and Facebook. Conservative Treehouse, which is a popular conservative blog, just was deplatformed by WordPress, the website hosting platform. We've talked before about what MailChimp is doing to blacklist conservative groups. This is deplatforming conservative groups from the digital space, not just your Facebook or Twitter account. But to your study, Eric, about the culture on campus, you looked at 820. A study of 820 British academics drew on the largest and most representative sample of academic opinion and free expression to date. YouGov maintained a panel of about 500,000 respondents, including some 100,000 current or retired academics who completed the survey. And what does that survey tell us?
Yeah, well, basically, a couple of things jump out because often people will claim that a lot of the criticism of universities isn't based in data or that the data is skewed, but this is pretty rigorous, as rigorous as you're going to get. And one of the key findings was that 1 in 3 academics would discriminate against a known supporter of the leave side, that is, to leave the European Union. So if they knew somebody was a supporter of that position, which was voted for by about 52% of the British population, they wouldn't hire an individual. So we've got some pretty good evidence of political discrimination. And on a similar survey in the U.S., around 40% of academics polled said they wouldn't hire a known Trump supporter. So these are just pretty powerful indicators of the kind of discrimination that then leads to the loss of political diversity on campus in the professoriate. And then, of course, the knock-on effect of that is people then become very hesitant to express their political views to colleagues, and that then affects also the subjects they study. So there's this real issue of self-censorship. It's as distinct from direct censorship. There's also, I think, something much more pervasive, which is self-censorship, because you fear the consequences if your political views become known.
Well, then how do you change the culture on campus? Is it even possible? I mean, you have to have some sort of fifth column action with a plucky band of insurgents, it would seem to me, in the Ivy League and elsewhere, in order to accomplish anything. Otherwise, they're just picking professors off one at a time as needed, or shutting those down, like you say, through a culture that encourages self-censorship. And as they're continuing to do the hiring and vetting people for their political views, well, they're just shrinking the diversity of opinion on campus to the point where it'll be non-existent.
Well, yeah, I mean, we've seen already, say, between the 1990s and the 2010s, the share of conservatives in American academia is down to about 10%, from about 20%, and the share on the left is about 60% compared to the center. So the centrists have actually gone down in the left. The conservatives were already pretty low. The centrists have gone down, and the left has gone up to 60%. Now, in Britain, I mean, one of the things I argue for is that really only government action is going to be able to address this. I mean, we saw in the U.S. case with the Trump executive order on critical race theory or the Title IX removals. Those are the kind of actions that would be needed. Here in Britain, what we recommended was something called we need to create something called the Director of Academic Freedom on the university's regulator here, who would, so if somebody felt that their academic freedom was violated on campus, they could go around their universities and appeal directly to this individual, and therefore get around the kind of kangaroo courts and the sort of disciplinary apparatus of the universities, which are heavily politically skewed in many cases. And just knowing that you'd have recourse to something other than your university, I think would give a lot of academics at least some bravery to sort of begin to speak their mind a bit more freely, not worry about losing out on not just getting a job, well, not just being fired, but not being, for example, not being hired, not being given a grant, not being promoted, etc. It's those other things which are actually much more important. And so just having that kind of regulatory framework in place, I think would go some way. And it's not going to cure the problem of the sort of 9 or 10 to 1 left to right ratio, but it will at least make people freer to be able to speak their minds.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's just a more realistic step than what I'm about to propose, but it would seem to me that that they're nothing short of removing funding, whether it is state-sponsored funding or it is alumni funding, will get their attention.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm sympathetic, but my worry is that is still going to leave in place a fundamentally skewed setup. I mean, I'm coming around to the view that a more intrusive government regulation, so in Britain, requiring universities to submit every year a record of all the disciplinary actions they've taken around free speech, and if they have effectively violated the law, to be fined. So essentially, you're getting compliance through that kind of regulatory process. I just don't think this idea of good ideas driving out bad, or new universities popping up that are committed to free speech driving out the old ones, is going to work, because it's a bit like Google or Facebook or Twitter. These things are so big and they've got network advantages that there's no way they're going to be replaced. So I think you really do need to get in and start regulating the content. I don't think we can actually cut our way out of this problem. I think you've actually got to get people scrutinizing what the universities are doing in detail and holding their feet to the fire each year.
Yeah, but the concern there is you're going from the frying pan to the fire. You're going from college commissars regulating content to government commissars.
True, but I guess it's like the Supreme Court, where, if you imagine a Supreme Court had a particular ideological agenda, it's better in some ways to have it be politicized and to have the process transparent, and at least people can vote and parties can campaign on the Supreme Court. And similarly, I think you can hold governments to account if you don't like what they're doing on regulation of universities, whereas if you have a hands-off approach, then essentially you're leaving it to these social justice pressure groups and diversity administrators and others, HR people, to more or less control the process. So it's one of these ones where the hands-off deregulation approach is actually the worst one, because it more or less just gives an open field for what I call left modernist pressure group network to more or less control and capture these institutions. So here's an odd situation where actually governments are needed in order to improve freedom. Another example of that would be in some of the public schools here in Britain that are majority Muslim, where sort of an Islamist clique came into control of the school. The government had to step in and actually take control away from them and put them under special measures. Again, I think something very similar is needed in this situation, where you've got a clique or a network that's gained control, like a mafia that's gained control of the institution, and you need to have that democratic government with a mandate come in and actually more or less step in order to preserve people's freedom.
Eric, shifting gears to the election, you wrote an article about who are the real shy Trumpers. 45% of Republicans with degrees compared to 23% of Democrats with degrees said they feared that their careers could be at risk if their views became known. How does this affect polling? Because they all got it wrong. I mean, this blue wave did not happen.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things you noticed in the exit poll was how off the polls were for college-educated whites. I mean, this is something we don't really hear much about. It's always about the white working class without degrees. Actually, if you really look at the polls, the biggest polling errors, if you compare pre and post, was with white college-educated voters. And this is also the group that has the biggest majority saying that they're afraid that if their political views became known, their careers could be adversely affected or even be fired. That's coming from a Cato study recently. And so, we can look at this two ways. I mean, if you look at, you can either think of it in terms of people not wanting to answer the phone when a pollster calls up, maybe because they don't want to reveal their views, or you can also think of it in terms of a sort of reaction against political correctness, that people are resentful of media, anything associated with media or academia, and it's that reactance that's coming out in terms of these polls. So Frank Luntz, for example, the Republican pollster, reported that over twice as many Republicans said they didn't share their voting intentions with friends. He reported a lot of resentment coming from people who were called up and asked to provide their intention to vote. So you're getting more of this blowback from this segment of the population, which corresponds pretty closely with the group that feels that it is most repressed in terms of what opinions it's allowed to express. And so I think we need a lot more attention then on this kind of conservative white college group. And they haven't had a lot of attention because the dominant narrative is, oh, well, they're all becoming liberal and democratic, and it's really only those uneducated people. But actually, that's not really the case. Moreover, if you actually look at survey data, what you see is education doesn't tell you a great deal about somebody's whether they're going to vote for, say, Trump or for Biden. It's much more about attitudes like attitudes to immigration, to political correctness, and so forth. And that varies a hell of a lot within the population of university graduates. And so you really need to get into that to explain who was missed. And I think that's being recognized now. I think there was a piece, I think David Shore in Vox was saying, or I don't know if it was David Shore, he was being interviewed, and he said, we're getting the right mix of educated and not educated, but we're not getting the proper mix of people who trust and don't trust the media. We're getting too many people who trust the media in these polls, and that's skewing them.
Well, in the meantime, until those ills are cured, me and the other Winston Smiths will just continue dutifully reciting Under the Spreading Chestnut Tree, Eric. But we appreciate your efforts. Eric Kaufman, professor of politics, Birkbeck College, University of London, and author of White Shift, Populism, Immigration, and the Future of White Majorities. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Connect with Dan and Amy on the AM 560 The Answer mobile app. Just text the word app to 6